Great to have you company on Sky News across Australia. Now, Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk is in somewhat of a doubt over when the borders will open, saying mass protests have impacted locking in July 10 as the opening date. She's also claimed in State Parliament today that most Queenslanders do not want the borders opened. Don't know about that, despite a backlash and pressure from businesses. Meanwhile, the LNP appears to be unstable amid claims of a backroom campaign to oust leader Deb Frecklington. Joining me now, Queensland LNP Senator Gerard Rennick. Gerard, great to see you tonight. What do you make of these border closures? Have you had much feedback from your constituency on whether, in fact, the borders should be reopened prior to July 10?
Hi, Peter. It's good to be with you. Look, the feedback I've had in the first instance is they just want some certainty from the Premier. They're sick and tired of her flip-flopping. And, look, I think people were willing to, down tools over the COVID break, but it has been a number of weeks now since we've had any new cases in Queensland. It's probably fair to say that the risk it hasn't been eliminated, but it's been significantly reduced. And if she's not going to open the borders, given the low case rate we've had in the last month, when will she open the borders? And it's actually my personal opinion that effectively JobKeeper payments should be deducted from GST payments if she continues to keep the borders closed, because the Australian taxpayer shouldn't have to be subsidising indecision by Anna Palaszczuk.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Senator. I think, most people... I can't believe she said that today, that the majority of people want the borders closed. I mean, we've done polling here at the Courier Mail, which suggests very clearly that the majority of people in this state want the borders reopened. And the other thing I want to ask you about the borders, Gerard, she keeps saying they're relying on medical advice. Well, I mean, I've spoken on the show about this before. Professor Paul Kelly, who's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and he's the bloke who keeps saying the borders don't need to be closed, is probably in the top half a dozen experts in the world on infectious disease. I mean, he's on 2 World Health Organisation boards looking specifically at pandemic and infectious disease. He's a genius. If you can't take his advice, whose advice are you taking?
Well, I think she's taking political advice, and I think it's reflective of the fact that Anna Palaszczuk has never really taken much risk in her life. Look, we all deal with risks every day, especially in the private sector. Small business, risk is what they do. And I just think that, she's got to remember that it's not her wearing the pain here. It's our small business owners in particular that are wearing the pain, and quite admirably have taken massive sacrifices, which she, turned around and then effectively spat in their eye by allowing those protests to go ahead a few weeks ago. So she can't have it both ways. She can't say she doesn't want to reopen because of the risk, and then on the other hand, just let protests take place. So, I would call on Anna Palaszczuk to state exactly what it's going to take for her to reopen, stop flip-flopping, because the people of Queensland have suffered enough under 30 years of Labor.
All right. Now, you're a member of the LNP. There's been a lot of argy-bargy in the last 48 hours about what's going on behind the scenes in Queensland in relation to the leadership of Deb Frecklington. There's been accusations of backroom bullying. They've been leaking information about marginal seats that doesn't reflect well on the leader here. What do you make of all this?
Look, can I say I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the volunteers in the LNP. And as a paid parliamentary member of the LNP, I will always be grateful to every volunteer in the party. And it's very important that we remember, as parliamentary members of the party, that the volunteers don't get paid for this. And no one puts in a greater effort than the party president. I mean, those guys give up just about every minute of their day. They're constantly having, buckets of manure tipped on their head. I was volunteered some time up in the last state campaign, and it is a lot of work involved. And I know that I'm very grateful. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the volunteers in the party. When I have a bad day in the media, it's always the volunteers that call me, and I'm extremely grateful, and I will always serve the volunteers of the party. And I think all parliamentary members should show the respect to the party the brand of the party and its great history and values, and that we basically stay focused on the enemy, which is Queensland Labor, who after 30 years, they brought in poker machines, they've closed maternity wards, they've shut down councils, they've destroyed farmers' rights, they've destroyed miners' rights, they've destroyed fishing rights, they've destroyed timber rights. They've basically brought Queensland to their knee, and the real enemy is Queensland Labor, and we have to kick Anna Palaszczuk out come October and get Queensland going again by building dams and more infrastructure, and get small business and our tourism operators, our farmers, our miners back on their feet.
Don't you think, though, there's a bit of a conflict of interest here? Your president, Dave Hutchison, is on the payroll of Clive Palmer. Now, Palmer played an instrumental role in removing Campbell Newman as Premier in 2015. How can you have a bloke who's running the LNP in Queensland who's being paid by another political party boss?
Okay, well, as I just said, David's a volunteer. I do know David very well, and he's always been a good supporter of mine. He has to make a living. He's got a family. You know, he's got a family to feed, and you know, look, you know what he does with Clive Palmer, I can't say, but I do know that you can't have. He can't do this on his own, in the sense that it costs a lot of money. I'm estimating it probably costs $40,000 to $50,000 a year, the expenses of being president. But I do know David's been a volunteer in the party, member of the Queensland LNP for 20 years, and his loyalty has always been to the Queensland LNP. And you know, for him to take on the role of the president at his young age with such a young family was a great sacrifice on his behalf. And what I do know is that he will be focused on making sure that the Queensland LNP win power at the next state election.
Gerard, let's talk about China. Now, the Morrison government has been very strong on this. To their credit, you know, agitating for the inquiry into how COVID started, you know, not backing down when they've come in with those heavy sanctions on Bali. I mean, you know, there are a lot of people in Australia right now who have run out of patience with China, and we're now looking at diversifying the way in which we do our trade with places like India and Indonesia. You must be really supportive, or heavily supportive, of diversifying that trade web, if you like, throughout the country.
Absolutely, Peter. I'm supportive of diversifying trade, but I'm also supportive of keeping a cool head and sound diplomacy. And whether you like it or not, China's here to stay, and we have to work with them. We have separate values to China, but we should always seek to strive to find common interests. So I actually spoke about this in my maiden speech. I was fortunate enough when I was younger to go to a number of countries, including China. And we must always remember that the government and people are two different things. And sometimes people at the government level, you know, call them the elites if you want, not always the same as the people at the ground level. And you know, I think I spent about 10 weeks in China all up, and 2 years travelling across the world, just backpacking, and another 5 years working in various countries. And the one thing I learnt from my travels is that we're all the same. We all want a roof over our head, food in our stomach, best opportunities for our children. And I just think that, you know, I know, you know, there's a time and a place for belligerent rhetoric, but China is a major trading partner of ours, and while we should always stand up for our values, we've always got to respect what their point of view and try and find some common ground.
Well, Senator, before we go, you made some controversial remarks last week in Parliament about the fact that, you know, people should be keeping their kids at home, that you're not a big fan of childcare. It created quite a bit of controversy. You're sticking by those comments?
Yes, I will, because I never said that parents should keep their child at home. What I said is that we should give greater choice to the parent, and that's not to parents, and that is whether or not they want to stay at home, or keep their children at home, or send the child to childcare. And not only that, the type of childcare. So, for example, at the moment the government pays the childcare centres directly. I think that the government should be paying the parent directly, and then the parent makes the choice as to what is best for their children. At the end of the day, I don't want the government stepping into the role of the parent, and I think the parent's entitled to decide. So some parents, both parents might work shift work, One parent might work in the morning, another one might work in the afternoon. They may only need 2 hours of childcare, so it would be easier for them to bring a nanny to the house instead of having to drive the child to childcare, which could be another half an hour away, and likewise the other parent then coming in and doing the pickup. But I make no apology. Robert Menzies, in his Forgotten People speech, mentioned the home 23 times, and I want to make sure that our children aren't left behind in today's rat race.
All right, Senator Gerard Rennick, great to see you tonight. Thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me on, Peter.